Thank you, Rebecca, and welcome to this session on the work of the Saudi Arabia subgroup of Amnesty Newcastle. I'm going to skip over the main details fairly quickly, but I think there's a lot of potential discussion points if you want to get back to me in the chat or at the end of the session. So, first of all, I wanted to say something about how I got involved in this particular issue. As an Amnesty activist for about 10 years, I've been getting increasingly interested in the issue of human rights in the UK, and in particular how football and initiatives such as Football Welcomes Refugees might possibly have the potential to reach a greater audience than Amnesty concerns perhaps generally do. So obviously when the takeover led by the Saudi Arabian PIF consortium came about and landed on our doorstep, I really felt I had to get involved. My reaction to the takeover was very mixed. Newcastle United was a club that certainly needed a takeover, but at the same time one was already aware that there were considerable human rights issues going on in the country of Saudi Arabia. And on further study, this was certainly confirmed, although there was obviously also some trend towards liberalisation in a variety of areas, one of which perhaps particularly was the rights of women, although that's certainly an area that's open to some discussion. What is clear is that since the takeover, further steps to liberalisation have been few and far between, but the amount of repression has increased dramatically. So the first thing I attempted to do was to contact Newcastle United Supporters Trust with a view to forming a joint group which would have the purpose of looking carefully at what's going on in Saudi Arabia. And one of their board members made quite a lot of supportive noises about this, but in the end nothing happened. So we went ahead on our own and formed the subgroup as part of Amnesty Newcastle. We have since publicised this to the Supporters Trust, and they did say that they would disseminate it in their group email, but so far I'm afraid to say this hasn't happened either. Although I do believe that they are an important organisation to work with, as the one that has the clearest voice of supporters in an organised fashion, and the only one that has the ear of the club, unlike under the previous regime of Mike Ashley. So that was my reaction. This, as you may recall, was the fans' reaction. Quite ironic contrasts here. Saudi headdress and copious amounts of alcohol. I think you know the stories. Cans littering St James's Park, Saudi flags being flown, and quite a bit was made of that at the time. Although, again, something this is I can explain a bit more detail. I don't think it was really as significant as it was made out to be. So what were the aims of the group once we got going? First of all, obviously, it was to publicise the human rights issues, all the executions that were going on, the tendency to hand out massive and unjust sentences to human rights defenders, liberal clerics, members of the Shia religious minority, etc., etc., etc. At the same time, we thought it was important to establish clearly accurate information about what was going on in the country. And we have indeed exchanged an awful lot of links and articles on this subject over the past few months. And the reason this is important is the danger of some misinformation getting about. I have found instances where locally people are claiming that certain things are still going on in Saudi Arabia that I don't believe can be corroborated. Now, a word of caution here, because Saudi Arabia is a far more disparate country and certainly a far more rural country in some parts than we would tend to immediately realise. But I don't, for example, believe that gays are still being flogged for their sexuality, in spite of the fact that the Saudi government abolished flogging as a punishment in 2020, nor that, for example, death by stoning is being used as a method of capital punishment anymore, and one or two other bits and pieces. Now, it may be these things are happening, but they're certainly not reaching social media, and they're certainly not meeting the press. And there are many, many things that are going on in Saudi Arabia, and it seems to me to make logical sense that we concentrate on those rather than things that effectively have the status of only rumour. On the other hand, I did notice that shortly after the takeover, there seemed to be a little series of stories appearing in fairly minor publications in the Middle East that were suggesting a very high degree of, and almost a Western degree of liberalisation going on in the country. And it struck me that at least a couple of them, in retrospect, may well have been plants or temporary stunts that had been organised. Incidentally, on this subject, the position of Al Rumayyan, the chair of the Newcastle United board, who has been accused of being a Saudi Minister of State in a recent trial in the US, is also interesting, because if you go back beyond the 1st of March, there are precious few mentions, in fact only one, of him being possibly a Minister of the State. One of the aims we didn't have was to overthrow the current board, unlike an organisation that is also active. We take this stand because, first of all, we don't believe it's achievable. We also think it will be very divisive amongst the fans of Newcastle United, who, it has to be realised, were largely in support of the takeover. And how can I put it? If I could select 10 typical so-called Newcastle United fans and ask them the question, what would you rather have, a trophy for Newcastle United or the end of human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia, I'm not entirely convinced that they come out in favour of ending the human rights. And it must be added, and certainly this is the perception of Newcastle United Supporters Trust followers, that the club is being far better managed than it was under the current regime, not only on the pitch in footballing terms. There have been massive improvements to the club infrastructure, junior development, training facilities, all this is underway. And also, interestingly, the incorporation of the women's team, which frankly I didn't even realise under the current regime wasn't technically connected to the club. And one thing I would add, though, is that we certainly do support the attempts by the like of Fair Game, from whom you will hear shortly, to amend the owners and directors test so that further takeovers come under much closer scrutiny. So anyway, what sort of actions have we undertaken? Well, here's the main ones. We started with an action, a petition, to free Abdul Rahman al-Sudan, a human rights defender who'd been sentenced to 20 years in jail with equivalent travel ban, simply for making some sarcastic entries on Twitter. Now, we picked on Abdul Rahman particularly because it seemed to us that his sentence was unduly severe, compared, for example, to the 10-year sentence received, albeit with some flogging, to Raif Badawi a decade earlier. Also, there was an interesting coincidence in that his appeal against conviction was overturned literally 2 days before the Newcastle United takeover. So it seemed to us to have a degree of local significance. At that time, we didn't know that even more severe sentences were going to be handed out for tweeting to Salma al-Shabab, 34 years plus equivalent travel ban, and Noura al-Qatani, 45 years and travel ban. So you can see how things have got worse in that respect. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, our petition has not received a response from the Saudi authorities, but it did sort of launch an interesting train of events, because I happened to mention it to my local MP, and she quite spontaneously, and to my surprise, offered to present our petition to Parliament. This hasn't actually happened yet, but is, I gather, scheduled for the current session, subject to the agreement of the Commons clerks. Now, perhaps encouraged by this, we started a little bit of a letter writing campaign to local MPs, focusing on a significant report by the London-based ALQST organisation, who campaign on issues in Saudi Arabia, wherein they make 19 very clear recommendations to the UK government as to how they think they should improve their attitude to Saudi Arabia, which they currently describe as being a soft touch. So we picked on that and one or two other things, and wrote to local MPs on Tyneside and somewhat beyond. And I'm pleased to say that we've had 4 quite sympathetic responses, 2 of which were particularly positive. Now, this, to my mind, represents something of a breakthrough, because at the time of the takeover, there seemed to be a bit of a conspiracy of silence amongst local politicians who did not really want to mention the issue of Saudi Arabia, knowing as they did that many of their constituents would be overwhelmingly in favour of the takeover. So that was a bit of a breakthrough, I think, and something that's been related to it has been the fact that Newcastle Council has decided to form a human rights forum. Now, we don't expect this to develop at great speed, but there was a promising initial meeting at the end of last year. It does have the support of significant councillors, and we hope that they will be producing much more by the time of International Human Rights Day this year. The other one we picked up on was the campaign against the arms trade's legal case against the UK government over the export of arms to Saudi Arabia. This has led to a court case which was held at the end of January and finished on the 2nd of February. And I must admit that I don't know the outcome of that case, but we thought it was a very significant thing to support because, well, commentators in the Middle East are indicating that they think that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia is tiring of the Yemen war and looking for a way out. Not that it will be easy to bring about, but perhaps if we could get the UK government to put a ban on further weapons going to Saudi Arabia, it would give them the necessary encouragement to seek a resolution. So that's a little bit about some of the main things we've done, and here's a couple of illustrations. Here we are at the Tyneside Irish Centre collecting signatures on the petition for Abdur Rahman's release. At the front of the picture, down at the bottom on the left, you can see a picture of Abdur Rahman together with his sister Arij, who's been speaking out for him since his conviction, and I'm pleased to say that you'll hear a contribution from her later on today at 3:30. Here we are again a few days later at Sunderland Minster, together with members of Wearside Amnesty Group and a couple of Durham University students, supporting the CAAT campaign in solidarity with the people of Yemen. You can't really see beyond that there's a map of the UK there, but what it does is point out the various locations in our country where the companies like BAE Systems are manufacturing weapons for export to Saudi Arabia. And the overall message of their campaign was that the war is starting at home. Where has all this led me? I have various reflections, really, which are in the form of a series of questions. First of all, I wonder why a state needs to inflict so many death penalties, so many ridiculously severe sentences, and I can only come to the conclusion that it is perhaps somewhat less secure than from the outside we might actually believe. This has been given some credence by a quote from Prince bin Salman in 2018, when asked to justify his repressive methods. He indicated that they were, in his view, the only way of preventing a civil war. So could it be that there may be some prospect of regime change in Saudi Arabia, and from where will it come? These are all questions, by the way, I don't really expect anyone to answer, but if you wish to follow them up with me, they can be discussed in more detail. It is fairly clear, I think, that Saudi Arabia will continue its links to football. We already know that through the Saudi Tourist Board, they're going to support the World Club Cup competition at the end of the year. And through the same agency, the Women's World Cup, although I must say with now some opposition from the Australian and New Zealand FAs. And further beyond that, they have their eyes on the Men's World Cup in 2030, which they hope to sponsor in conjunction with the other human rights offender, Egypt, and also the country of Greece with a European context. So I think that what all that means is that we can expect the same sort of debates that went on over the Kuwait World Cup to continue. The issues about the kafala system, the issues about gender recognition in particular countries, and also the role of FIFA. All of these things, I think, will be rehearsed over and over again over the coming years. Next question is about the importance of pressure from the West. And at the moment, of course, there is no pressure from the West, because we're really trying to be nice to Saudi Arabia in the hope of getting some more cheap oil out of them. So it would be interesting to see what would happen if this pressure was resumed. Would it lead to an amelioration of human rights in Saudi Arabia? Or has the country gone so far in identifying with countries like Russia and China that they're no longer going to show much interest in what the West has to say? A personal one is who calls the shots on the Newcastle United board. It's generally assumed to be the PIF representatives, but I'm not totally sure. Al Rumayyan has indicated in the local press that he's quite happy for them to sit on their hands and wait for a massive profit at some time in the future. And it also seems to me that, for example, Amanda Staveley is a woman with a formidable voice, and I'm quite convinced that it was in fact her who brought about the integration of the women's team into the club. But for example, a question like who decided to adopt a former Saudi Arabian football national strip as a Newcastle United change strip is something that would interest me. And last of all, there's been a little bit something about Amnesty's capacity to respond to all these issues, because over the past months, I think we've found, both in the case of Amnesty UK and through the country coordinator, the International Secretariat, that it's been really quite difficult to get answers to questions. However, I am pleased to say that there has been some improvement in that matter over the past week or so, actually. Okay, so that's basically the main things that I think have come out of all this. Last of all, talking about Saudi shirts, it wouldn't be an Amnesty event, would it, if there wasn't some sort of action? So not being able to meet with you personally, we pre-recorded one at Newcastle United Football Club on a very cold day, I might say, and with a little prefix in the country of Northumberland. So here we go. Yep, okay, in Saudi Arabia only birds can tweet freely, so our message is support the team, but not the regime. Okay, so thanks very much for listening. And the last thing we'd like you to do, if you could, it would be to take part in a Twitter and social media storm tomorrow from 12 noon. And you can also follow it on Instagram and on Facebook. And the hashtags to watch for are support the team, not the regime, and free Sudan. That's being our attempt to continue with the campaign on Abdulrahman al-Sudan. And when you hear from his sister Arij later on, I think she will be explaining to you why for her Sunday the 12th of March is an extremely significant date. Thank you again for listening.